Wilder Outdoor Academy. In today's lesson, I'll show you how to start a one-match fire using an upside-down fire lay. Now, before we start, there's some safety things we need to talk about. Fire is very dangerous. Don't ever play with matches without a responsible person around. So if you're a kid, you have to have an adult around if you're doing this. It's just very dangerous. We don't want to play with fire ever. That said, if we're going to build campfires outside, there are a few things we need to take into consideration. The first thing you need is a fire ring. So mine's made out of stones, yours could be made out of cinder blocks, whatever you like, but something that won't burn needs to make a circle around where you're going to build your fire. And that's so that the fire won't spread to places we don't want it to. The second thing is you want to build your fire ring far away from any structures. So at least 30 feet. You can see my house is way more than 30 feet away from this fire ring. But we don't want to accidentally catch anything on fire that we don't want to be on fire, because fire spreads and it destroys things. So that's really important. If you don't have access to a fire ring, what you can do is dig a ditch or a hole in the ground, and it'll do the same thing. It'll contain that fire right below the surface of the ground. So that's a great option too. The last thing is, when you are done with your fire, you're going to douse it with water and stir it. That makes sure that there are no embers. You can start a fire just from embers. So on a windy day, if there's just a glowing hot coal and something passes over it while it's blowing, that coal could heat that thing up and start a new fire when you're not there. So always douse your fires when you're done. So now that we've got safety out of the way, there are a few things to know about fire, namely what's called the fire triangle. So I always say that starting a fire in your home is incredibly easy and very scary. Starting a fire in the woods can be incredibly hard if you don't know what you're doing. I'm not sure why that is, but that's just the way it goes. So to get a fire going outside successfully, you need to know about the fire triangle. The fire triangle is fuel, oxygen, and heat. And for all of those things to come together, that's when we get fire. That's when we get a combustion. And fire is a great tool to have, right? It's a great thing to know how to build. It's important to survive. If you're camping, it keeps you warm, lets you cook your food, it can keep animals away. It's awesome. And we want to make sure that we are always thinking about those three things when we're building our fire. Do we have fuel? Do we have heat? And do we have oxygen? And the reason I say oxygen is because air has to get to the heat and the fuel so that it can ignite. And where that will really come into play is as the fire is starting, especially if we want it to keep going, if it starts to die down, we're going to blow on it gently. The other thing, or the other area where air will come into play, or oxygen comes into play, is when we build our fire lay, our fire structure, it has to be able to breathe. So air has to pass through what's burning or past what's burning to get a fire going. So it's really easy to pile a bunch of wood on top of your fire and then all of a sudden it goes out because there's no air going to it. That said, the fire lay I'm going to show you today takes care of a lot of that for you. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so what you can see here is I've laid out a bunch of wood. So for my fire, there are three kinds of fuel that we use. The first, which is what we use to start our fire, is called tinder. Now there are lots of kinds of tinder. Today I'm going to use pieces of birch bark. So if you don't know, birch is a white tree that tends to grow in marshy areas, and its bark is like paper. If you peel it off, it is full of oil and can be peeled into very thin layers, like this. My favorite tinder to use, though, are pine needles, but because we are just in the beginning of spring, most of my pine needles are wet and still under a little bit of snow. So today I'll be using a mix of birch bark and pine needles. The next kind of fuel that we have is called kindling. And kindling are sticks. They're made of wood, typically. They could be pine cones, but they are not so thick that they'll take a lot of time to light. So these are very, very thin sticks. We're going to lay them on top of our tinder as it burns, and these will catch very quickly, but they will also burn very quickly. So we need a lot of them. And then I have my fuel, which I arrange before I start. I always arrange them before I start from small to medium to big. And I arrange them because once I start making the fire, there's a period of time where I have to keep working or the fire will go out. So I always want to lay my fuel out beforehand, thinking about how I'm going to use it. Now for the upside down fire lay, it's a little bit different than most fire lays, but it's really cool because it takes care of itself. It's pretty much self-maintaining. The reason we call it upside down is because we do it backwards from all the other fire lays, and that is to start with our biggest fuel first. So here I'm going to take large pieces of fuel, my largest fuel, and I'm going to lay them down in a line like a mat on the ground. And here I've got use 4 pieces, 4 of my thickest pieces on the bottom. What I'll do is I'll go down to the next thickness in my pile, which is just not a lot. So we want it to be very gradual in terms of going from thin pieces of wood or thick pieces of wood to thin pieces of wood. But here I'll take my next layer down and I'll start layering it in the other direction. And I don't want a ton of space. I want a little bit of space, but not a ton, because if I put too much space, the fire won't burn. If I don't put enough space, there won't be oxygen to get through it. So I'm going to take my next layer of wood, lay it in the other direction. So I started by going this way. Now I'm going this way. I'm just going to do that over and over again, each time using a slightly thinner layer of wood. So going from my biggest fuel to my medium-sized fuel, then eventually a little bit smaller, and I keep creating layers, forwards, sideways, over and over again. And what's going to happen is where with most fire lays, you light your fires from the bottom and build up. We're actually going to light this one on the top, and each of the cracks in the structure are going to let the burning embers drop down and catch the layer beneath it on fire, which is kind of a cool feature. And because it does that, we can usually just let it burn down all by itself. We don't have to maintain it like we do with other structures. And so here, I'm almost to the point where I'm putting my tinder on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep a lot of tinder set aside because I'm going to feed the fire tinder as it goes. So I want a few layers of tinder in here, but I want to keep most of it out of the fire for the time being because it's going to get fed in. So here, you can see now I've got a pretty good stack. It goes from the thickest wood to thinner wood. Now I'm going to take tinder, lay a few layers of that on. So very, very thin wood, because again, I want my fire to drop down and catch the layers below it on fire. So if there's not anything thin under where I'm lighting it, it won't light. So just some light tinder here, laying across. Now we get ready for the show. What I'm going to do is take 2 pieces of kindling, a little bit thicker. It can be light fuel too. And I'm going to lay them here. I'm going to create sort of a channel. So see, I have 2. I lay them like this, and I create a small channel. And in that channel, I'm going to lay some of, but not all of, my tinder. So here I'm going to take some birch bark. I'm going to tear it up real good. This birch bark is still a little wet, so it might take a few times to light. I'm going to lay some of my pine needles in here. And what's going to happen is when this lights, I'm going to start layering my kindling across in a thatched way. So like I did with the bottom layers, I'm going to layer one layer like this, one layer like this, one layer like this, one layer like this. I'm going to do it fast, and I'm going to add air as it starts to die down. Once that fire really starts to burn on top and you can see that it's starting to drop down, you can stop and leave it. So let's see if we can get this done with one match. Okay, I've got my matches. I've got my tinder, lots of tinder over here, lots of extra kindling. Let's see if we can do this with one match. I'm going to light the tinder. It goes up fast. Once that's burning, I'm going to start to layer my kindling on top, fast as I can, leaving it air to breathe, right? A room for the air to get through. If it starts to go down, like it is, I'll add a little bit of air. I'll throw on some extra tinder just to keep it going. And I just keep adding these layers with lots and lots of room, but again, very thin material so that the fire can breathe and catch quickly. This is where a fire can either be a success or a failure. Going through here. I'm going to add a little oxygen gently because I don't want to blow it out. And that's starting to die down a little bit, so I'm going to add some more tinder just on top. A little bit of that birch bark. Add some more oxygen. There we go. Once that starts to burn, lay my tinder across, or my kindling across. We just keep going. Go and go and go until the fire is kind of burning itself down through the structure. And that is how you make a one-match upside down fire lay.